And good day, everybody. David Cross here. Just finished having my coffee and was working through my lab early this morning and had another Node-RED workflow, lab workflow, for a project I was working on in terms of loading DNS data and taking a dig from a DNS for doing a zone transfer from various lab servers that we work with or customer data or just general loading and practicing and so forth into create a workflow that could automate the import of those resource records directly from the dig. And for those who are familiar with IPControl, we do have a CSV file that we can load, and we can do this through the import wizard, and effectively allows us to load what they call DNS domain records, and then also the ability to import device records or zone records. And just for the understanding of how this and what I'm trying to do, the domain is where we store all of the resource records, and I have, example of a domain. And this is also where we define the SOA and various counters for refresh, retry, and so forth. But in the resource records, as we create IP devices and as we create domain level records like MX records or things that belong at the domain that don't have host, they all get organized back into this resource record tab. So we do have a method that allows us to import directly to this and then also even create device records through this import if it's say for a record and we know what the IP address is and the subnet exists, we can also do some conditional creates. So what I was interested in doing is, and I have other applications that go about converting dig data so I can display it and do queries and zone transfers. And you may have seen it through one of my admin tools, the DNS admin toolbox. But in this case, I wanted to do it through shell, and I wanted to be able to make it available very simply through a standard procedure and another shell script. And again, using the curl upload procedures so that I can take this dig information and then upload it into the Node-RED, where it can then be processed, converted into its equivalent import, and then import it into IPControl into its domain record and or report errors or skip or do other types of capabilities. So my first iteration of this is doing just that. I'm going to go in and I'm going to have my DNS domain, which is automatemyip.com, that's registered. And I have a server that's currently running that I have access to in a main DNS level access to zone transfer and to be able to pull those records. So what I want to do then is I'm going to do a very simple dig, and I'm going to put a couple command line arguments there that are going to specify the server. So in the dig, in the bash, I'm going to do dig at server IP and then tell it the domain that I want to do the transfer from. I'm then going to go ahead and tell it to skip anything that empty lines, anything that has comments, and then it's going to go ahead and pull out, changing certain spaces and tabs and so forth so I can process it. And the output of this is going to pipe it just to a file with the process ID. And then I'm going to upload this file into this Node-RED workflow that will then import it and or return the results and remove the file when it's complete. And just so you can kind of see this in action, I just showed you the domain was empty, but I'm just going to go ahead and run this. And I'm going to pipe it to my JQ as well so you can see the results because I am returning it. And effectively what we then have is in the domain import, it went ahead and did the dig. It created all of those imports and effectively imported those records, that quickly, which was great. It's exactly what I wanted to do. And then even in the results, I have it piping back that it shows you any fault strings. Like currently, I have a custom fault that I'm setting up to skip SOA and NS records. However, I might use the NS record to create the delegation record if I want to maintain that or even modify it at some point for hidden masters and things. And then also any kind of duplicate records. So if I attempted to import this again, I would then get messages back determining that there's duplicates, and it would have the error messages related to those records. So I have quite a bit set up here, and it's allowing me to go ahead and import the records and define it. And the next steps would be then to perhaps do other checks like get the SOA record, verify, update the SOA, maybe even do incremental zone transfers at some point, comparing the SOA and only pulling in records versus the whole zone and others. But for this process, step one, phase one, this is where I wanted to go with that and kind of what I'm looking at and in terms of its capabilities. Right. So to do that and kind of back up and go over some of the workflow again, As I had mentioned previously, I have a user which I use, which allows me, typically read-only access. However, in this case, you do need to have an administrator who is capable of read-write permission and has read-write permission to the domains themselves and or has super user or what they call master user rights. Now, you want to probably set this up to be a workflow and have some type of login. Again, I'm using just a custom account to do it for testing. So here, basically what I'm going to do is my endpoint that's going to be consumed by my external flow, the curl command basically, is I'm setting this up to be DNS zone import. Now I have workflow here because I had copied this from my cloud automation appliance. But in this particular lab environment, it's just going to be /DNS zone import. And like the other uploaded procedures, I'm simply going out and looking into the message request files 0, so the 0 buffer, and then converting that to a string, because this is a string and it's UTF-8 conversion. That then converts a payload, which is going to be an object, which I'm then going to split on a new line. So knowing that this is a dig output, it has new line, and each line should be a record, and then I can verify through the split and pipe it through a function where I do a number of things. So here I want to copy the original message back into the original message property, which I'm later going to use. I then set up a couple of fields, which I do a split on spaces. If you're familiar with dig and you're familiar with its output results, you're going to get basically a space delimiter with all of the records. And everything is going to be fully qualified, which is why I like this process, so that we can determine host names and not have to be conflicting with dotted host names. A lot of times if you don't have the name label fully qualified and you have a dotted host name, you're not really sure what the subdomain or the parent domain is, and this helps us to do that. But it also captures every one of the types of records, so I don't have to go in and manually set up any type of, functions to verify the record or to do any other syntax. However, and benefit of our company and its products, we deal with importing resource records the same. It doesn't matter what the type of the record is. They all have a owner, which is the left-hand side of the record. They all have potentially a TTL and a type. And then they have the record type, which is the only thing that modifies, and the data. So knowing that there's only those fields, why have a separate API for every resource record type, or have to define this 100 different ways because there's so many different records? So we have a simplified way of doing this, but this is what that looks like. And I wanted to go in and parse this out, and then it's, although somewhat duplicate here, I set this up this morning to verify it. But the first thing is I wanted to verify the SOA, and so that if there is a SOA, I want to grab the domain. So this is where I'm going to pull in domain, which I'm going to later use in my resource record set. And that's why I'm kind of doing an if statement on this to verify it individually. Now I'm setting this up to be a flow record because the first record in the dig may not be an SOA, but it might need to be referenced afterwards. However, I need to at some point get this domain record up there so I can pull it, and it is typically the first record. So when it does that, I set a flow variable of domain, and I set it to this, and I set the domain variable for this to further move through. However, in the next set, I'm doing a verification check to verify that it's not an OSOA or an NS record, because I don't want to import those into the domain. NS records belong within the zone, and I haven't at this point determined that the zone is there. I might have to do some other checks, etc. Same with the SOA. I'm not going to import it because we maintain that at the domain level in IPControl, so we're not going to import the SOA. But everything else that falls in between are standard resource records, and we will. So the format of this is a resource record, and an import is we're going to set the domain type, which I'm assuming default here, but I may have some arguments to flip this. The domain, which I'm grabbing from the SOA field, the owner, which I'm then walking through the fields in the way that we import these. So these specific fields are the order, and this will be then fields 0 through 4, owner being the domain again. And with the device resource record flag, I could do other processing where if the subnet existed and this were, say, an A record or PTR or something, I know what the IP address is or could calculate it and could then set this up to be a device record and confirm that it would be defined. Otherwise, if it doesn't have a subnet, it fails. the device record, but will still complete the DNS record. Just so you know. Now I have that process I mentioned, so I have a DNS token that I'm grabbing, which I then build for the headers. So I'm rebuilding my message headers to include this token that's being generated by this user up here. I'm also setting a timeout, which I don't think is being observed in my testing this morning, but supposedly it supports a timeout. And then, like I said, I'm copying the original payload back into the record so that I can later identify back to the user what failed and what the original message is in case you wanted to further process that, like creating a domain or a zone or doing something different. Now, the payload, because this is an object, requires that we stringify this to convert it back to JSON. So I am setting the payload to a JSON.stringified version of the RR, which I'm then going to set also into the message.rr property, and then I'm going to return that message and pass it on to the next message in the stream. Now, in this particular case, I'm going in to verify that the payload has a valid payload. There might have been some errors, or in the setting where I check whether this is NS or SOA, it sets this to an empty payload. So I'm going to verify that it's not those records, and if it is empty, I want to go ahead and create a custom error. So I'm creating my own fault string and fault detail and specifying what specifically is going to be returned in the message. That then is being returned back into the join. And the reason I'm going to do that is when we split, anything that's split, the join kind of expects a complete record message to be returned. And if for any reason it's missing one of those sequences, it won't finish the process. So I still need to return all of these back into the join or do that somewhere else, and I decide to do that here. So if you're doing that kind of development and you have that thing and you're having to skip out of a split or something, you want to add that back into your join or do something along those lines. Now I wanted to limit this. Only 5 import messages a second. I don't necessarily think I have any kind of limitation per se, but I didn't want to overwhelm the server in case there's a lot of other things happening. Pick and choose, modify yours. I might, open this up and let it throttle a little bit when I'm done. In the our object that we're creating, down at the bottom beneath the headers, I set the URL, and this is, physically pointing to my server, but again, I might do something more dynamic. And I'm calling the API, Ingress API v1 imports, and then the import domain resource record, which is the method. Just so you know on that. Now, when I do the import result that is returned from that is a null, effectively, or an error. So I know if it's null that it's success, and then I wanted to go in and create more of a message to let me know what was success. So instead of null, I return the RR or resource record that was being imported, and then I join it back and then return it back to the client. So all of that was, in phase 1, pretty good. And so when I look at this, I can either do this through the script where it does the import dynamically and things like it, or I can do the command dynamically just kind of on the command line if I were testing, just to upload and see things as they were, being set. So there you go, everybody. And if you're doing anything with DNS, check back with this. I'm going to try to update this in advance a little bit more, put some messages and indicators in there. Also maybe do some checks for the domain and for the zone, possibly import the domain and zone if you give it a server. Maybe some other things to automate this process if you do this regularly or are like a domain registrar and you need to keep and add, these types of domains. So thanks for bearing with me. I hope this wasn't too long for you, and check back for the next few. I might have some updates on a few other projects here, but I'm going to be going away for a couple of days, so maybe this weekend I'll catch back up with you. Take care and have a great day, rest of the week and weekend if we don't see you soon. Bye.